So, as some of you might know, and I'll apologise in advance for getting into policy detail here, but it is important that we try and interpret what's happening here at the talks for people, because as you might realise, they're incredibly complex. But as some of you might know, these talks are taking place along two tracks. So there's one track which is called the Kyoto Protocol track, which is about almost 40 rich countries from around the world who are trying to who've committed to kind of short-term emissions reductions, basically. And this track is trying to make sure that the rich polluting countries stop polluting, or rather stop polluting so much. And then there's another track which is called the Long-Term Cooperative Action Track, and this is involving everybody, because ultimately, if we're going to solve climate change, it's not just the rich countries that need to take action, although they need to take action first because they bear the biggest responsibility for the mess we're in and they're the biggest contributors to this problem. It's everybody, and so the Long-Term Cooperative Action Track is about getting a global effort to deal with this in the long term. Now, it's in this kind of part of the talks where there's been problems. So the latest negotiating text being discussed here is causing a bit of controversy, because there's been some kind of new market mechanisms inserted into it. I think Zaina's going to have a go at explaining these, which is.
Please go ahead.
You want me to? You want me to try and battle with it? Okay. Well, what these market mechanisms try and do basically is allow rich countries to carry on polluting, but effectively compensate poor countries for the privilege, and that's a fairly cynical take on it. Maybe a more positive angle would be that it's a more realistic way to cope with climate change, because rich countries aren't going to reduce their emissions levels fast enough. So if they invest in forests, for example, in the developing world, or if they buy the right to pollute from developing world countries, then they'll deal with the problem to some extent in that way. But this is a controversial topic, and organisations like Friends of the Earth have come out and said that it's not right, and that actually rich countries have a responsibility to reduce their emissions, not simply to kind of get around it by paying poor countries. And they say that there's better alternatives, and people should be looking at something called the Robin Hood tax, which I suggest you Google. It's essentially a big tax on financial institutions, on the banks, or on levies on aviation or shipping. So that's one of the kind of issues that's come up in the first day of the talks, or the first few days of the talks. What role is the market mechanisms going to play in terms of solving this problem over the long term? And there's some concerns that market mechanisms might also have a bigger role to play in the Kyoto Protocol track, in the short-term effort to get rich countries to stop polluting. So we'll see how that plays out, and we'll also try and get you some different perspectives, because, as I say, Friends of the Earth very critical, other organisations maybe not so critical. Zaina?
And from there, we move on to more on the Kyoto Protocol, actually, and Japan's stand. Japan announced on the first day of the talks that it wouldn't be bound by a second commitment period within the Kyoto Protocol unless the US and China joined it as well. This has surprised many of the people here at Cancun. It's been the subject of much talk and action. We're starting to see young activists here in Cancun taking action to send a message to Japan, and there is talk of mobilizing global activists all over the world in the next coming few days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Friends of the Earth might have an action up already, actually, to try and pressure Japan. So we'll see whether that comes and becomes a broader movement in the next week or so. The final little bit of news that we wanted to cover with you was that the UN Weather Agency, the World Meteorological Organization, has come out and said that 2010 is almost certain to rank as among the 3 hottest years on record, and that the period from 2001 to 2010 is the highest recorded period for temperatures since records began in 1850, I think. I think we've seen record-breaking temperatures in about 19 countries around the world now. These include Bolivia, Zambia, Qatar, Cyprus, Finland, Russia, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, Chad, Kuwait, Iraq, Pakistan. The list goes on. We're not talking kind of 30 degrees, 40 degrees. We're talking up to 53.5 degrees centigrade there. That's 128 degrees Fahrenheit. So literally unbearable conditions. I think I can turn my oven to that, and I certainly don't think I could survive those conditions for a long time. Meanwhile, whilst these countries are cooking, if you're watching this in the US or certainly in the UK, I know you're probably going for a very cold patch. It's led one British columnist to say that he thinks that God's against the climate talks. Why is it that just as these big international negotiations start happening, it always gets cold in rich countries, giving people an easy kind of excuse to go, oh, well, climate change isn't real, look out the window, it's snowing. So we'll have to see if we can help people get over that difficulty and empathise with the problems that people are facing around the world.
And from the World Meteorological Organization today, a press briefing at COP16, the Russian heat wave was definitely a consequence of global warming. The Pakistan floods were definitely linked to the same weather system, which probably means that the Pakistan floods were a consequence of global warming. That was our news